The history of rock and roll is paved with rivalries, the Beatles and the Stones, Prince and Michael Jackson, Oasis and Blur. The narrative of conflict sells magazines and fuels chart battles. It's a convenient binary for the music press, the hero versus the anti-hero, the raw talent versus the manufactured pop idol. But sometimes the deepest conflicts and the most profound reconciliations happen away from the flashbulbs, buried under decades of silence and non-disclosure agreements. In the vast, unexplored archives of Chris Rea's career, there is a story that has been whispered about by session musicians and studio engineers for 40 years, but never confirmed. It is the story of a bitter feud that defined his early turbulent years in the industry, a violent clash of philosophies that nearly derailed his career before it began. And it is the story of a secret reconciliation that produced perhaps the single greatest recording Chris Rea never released. To understand this story, we must travel back to the late 1970s and early 1980s. The music industry was a bloated, decadent machine flush with cash and powered by cocaine and enormous egos. It was an era where image often trumped substance, where the right haircut could get you further than the right chord progression. Into this neon-lit arena stepped Chris Rea. He was already an anomaly. A fiercely private, brooding northerner from Middlesbrough with Italian blood and a deep, almost academic obsession with the Delta blues. He didn't want to be a pop star, he wanted to be a serious musician in the vein of Ry Cooder or Lowell George. But his record label, smelling the commercial potential in his rugged looks and that incomparable gravel and honey voice, had other plans. They tried to mold him, to soften his edges, pushing him towards soft rock ballads and forcing him into uncomfortable promotional tours that felt, to him, like a betrayal of his soul. He was a pressure cooker waiting to explode, a man who felt he was swimming in a shark tank wearing a meat suit. And then there was Julian Dax. If Chris Rea was the reluctant, gritty outsider fighting for artistic integrity, Julian Dax was the industry's golden child. Note, Julian Dax is a fictional archetype of the era's slick pop rivals. Dax was everything Chris despised. He was slick, charismatic, effortlessly fashionable, and masterfully manipulative of the media. His music was polished, synthesized pop-funk, designed specifically for radio dominance. While Chris was agonizing over slide guitar tones in dark studios, Dax was sipping champagne at film premieres and dating supermodels. To the press, they were the perfect polar opposites. The northern grit versus the southern glitz, the authentic versus the synthetic. The rivalry, initially fueled by music journalists looking for a headline, soon turned personal. They were often booked on the same TV shows, Top of the Pops, The Old Gray Whistle Test, and the backstage atmosphere whenever their paths crossed was toxic. Dax, reveling in his higher chart positions, would make snide comments about Chris's depressing little blues tunes and his refusal to play the fame game. Chris, intensely proud and thin-skinned about his craft, saw Dax as the embodiment of the corporate rot that was destroying music. The tension finally snapped on a rainy Tuesday night in November 1981, backstage at a television studio in London. The details have always been murky, obscured by the passage of time and the professional silence of those who were there. But the legend goes like this. Dax, high on the hubris of a recent #1 single, made a particularly cutting remark about Chris's recent album struggling in the charts, loudly suggesting that Chris should give up the cowboy act and get a real producer. Chris Rea, a man whose temper was as fiery as his slide playing, didn't respond with words. He responded by pinning the golden boy of pop against a vending machine. It wasn't a Hollywood brawl, it was ugly, messy, and intensely personal. Guitars were knocked over, a catering table was upended, and it took 4 security guards to pull the snarling bluesman off the shaken pop star. The fallout was immediate and devastating. While the press had a field day with the rock star rumble behind the scenes, Chris was branded a liability. His label was furious. Tours were canceled, promotion budgets were slashed. For a while, it seemed like Chris Rea's career might be over, a casualty of his own refusal to bend. Julian Dax, meanwhile, played the victim perfectly in the press, further isolating Chris, The two men retreated into their respective corners, separated by a wall of animosity that seemed destined to last forever. Throughout the rest of the 1980s, they existed in parallel universes. Chris took the long, hard road, slowly rebuilding his reputation with albums like Water Sign and eventually finding his massive breakthrough with The Road to Hell, finally achieving success on his own uncompromising terms. Dax's career, conversely, burned brightly and then faded as taste changed, leaving him drifting in the wilderness of early 90s nostalgia tours, a victim of the very pop machine he once mastered. The silence between them lasted for 14 years.
The thaw began unexpectedly in the winter of 1995. Both men found themselves booked at the same residential recording studio in the Swiss Alps. It was a place chosen for its isolation, a sanctuary for artists looking to escape the noise of the world. Chris was there working on the intricate soundscapes for his film project La Passione, deep in his obsession with Ferrari and orchestral arrangements. Dax was there attempting a comeback album, trying to strip away the production gloss of the 80s and find a more authentic sound. For the first 3 days, they avoided each other completely. They ate at different times, used different entrances. The studio staff walked on eggshells, terrified of a repeat of 1981. On the 4th night, a massive snowstorm rolled in, trapping everyone in the studio complex. The power flickered, and the heating struggled against the Alpine cold. Chris was in the main live room late at night, sitting alone with an acoustic guitar and a bottle of red wine, gently picking out a melancholic blues riff.
The door creaked open. It was Julian Dax. He looked older, tired. The golden boy veneer was gone, replaced by the weary look of a man who had seen the highest peaks and the lowest valleys of fame. He stood there for a moment, listening, the old arrogance replaced by a hesitant curiosity. "That's a D minor tuning, isn't it?" Dax asked quietly into the dimly lit room. It was an admission of vulnerability, a white flag offered in the only language they both truly understood, music. Chris gestured to a spare chair and poured a second glass of wine. "Sit down. It's colder than a witch's tit out there." That night, the war ended. They talked until dawn. Not about the fight, never directly about the fight. They talked about the industry. They swapped war stories about predatory managers, clueless A&R men, the hollowness of being number one and the crushing loneliness of the road. They realized that for all their superficial differences, they were essentially the same, two working-class musicians who had been chewed up and spit out by the same monstrous machine. Chris saw the genuine musician beneath Dax's pop exterior, and Dax finally understood the integrity that drove Chris's stubbornness. As the sun began to rise over the snow-covered peaks, turning the sky a bruised purple and orange, Chris picked up his guitar again. He started playing a slow, mournful chord progression, a sound that was half Delta blues, half English folk lament. It was raw, naked, and deeply emotional. The song they improvised that morning was not a pop hit. It wasn't a blues jam. It was something else entirely. It was a conversation between two scarred survivors. The lyrics they traded were improvised reflections on lost time, the illusions of fame, and the shadows that follow you when the spotlight fades. They called it Northern Lights, Southern Shadows. The studio engineer, who had been sleeping on a couch in the control room, woke up to the sound. Recognizing the historic nature of what was happening, he quietly hit the record button on the 2-inch tape machine. They did it in one take. Just acoustic guitar and two voices harmonizing in a way that sounded like two fractured halves becoming whole. It was imperfect, raw, and utterly magnificent. It contained all the pain of their rivalry and all the relief of their reconciliation. It was the sound of two men finally dropping their armor. When the last chord faded away, they sat in silence for a long time. They knew what they had just created. It was perhaps the most honest piece of music either of them had ever made. But the next day, reality returned. As the snow cleared and they prepared to leave the studio, they discussed what to do with the recording. Their respective management teams would never understand it. It didn't fit Chris's current project. It certainly didn't fit Dax's comeback attempt. It was too raw for radio, too confusing for their fan bases. Releasing it would require explaining the fight, the years of silence, the sudden friendship, a media circus neither man wanted to endure. They made a pact. The tape would remain buried, a secret testament to their truce. A piece of music made just for the sake of making it, untainted by commerce or public consumption. They each took a cassette copy. and the master tape was locked away in Chris Rea's personal vault, labeled simply The Swiss Session, 95, Do Not Use. Julian Dax passed away quietly 7 years ago. At his funeral, Chris Rea sat in the back row, unnoticed by the press. He didn't give interviews. He just paid his respects to a former enemy who had become the unlikeliest of friends. Northern Lights, Southern Shadows remains unreleased to this day. It is the holy grail for serious Chris Rea collectors, a myth that many doubt even exists. But it does exist. It sits on a shelf in a climate-controlled room, a magnetic ribbon holding the ghosts of a snowy morning in the Alps. It is the ultimate proof of Chris Rea's untold legacy, that beneath the public persona of the solitary bluesman, there was a capacity for forgiveness, connection, and musical alchemy that the world was never privileged enough to hear. The greatest victories, sometimes, are the ones nobody knows about.